The role of a park ranger dedicated to the conservation and protection of natural habitats is not without its perils. Tragically, there have been instances where park rangers find themselves facing fatal maulings by the very animals they seek to safeguard. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times park rangers were fatally mauled by deadly animals. Welcome to Final Affliction.
Nestled in the far eastern reaches of Russia is a land of wild beauty and rugged wilderness, the Kamchatka Peninsula. Here, the earth boils and steams with hot springs and geysers shooting steam high into the sky. It is a place of raw power where the earth itself seems to be alive and breathing. It is also home to an array of wildlife, from the majestic brown bear to the elusive snow leopard, where they roam the land freely in harmony with the landscape. For those who dare to venture into its depths, the Kamchatka Peninsula offers an unforgettable experience as the beauty of nature is on full display and the wilderness of the land can be felt in every breath. Vitaly Nikolayenko was one of Russia's best-known bear researchers to date. He had dedicated almost 30 years, which was approximately half of his life, to researching these majestic creatures. The 66-year-old was also a senior ranger in the Kronotsky Wildlife Reserve, where he constantly patrolled the wilderness to battle illegal fishing and hunting. It was during these patrols that Vitaly followed the enormous brown bears of the Kamchatka Peninsula while documenting their social, mating, and feeding habits. In the evening, he would return to his cabin, light the kerosene lamp, and then document nearly 800 bear contacts annually. His work turned into one of the most significant records of brown bear behavior ever made. As the years passed, Vitaly plunged into repeated encounters with bears. He got very close and personal with the bears, who seemed to not mind sharing their space with him. His personal favorite was a 6-foot male bear that he had named Krasavchik, which means handsome. He was fond of Krasavchik and at times would lie next to the beast as it took a nap. In December 2003, Vitaly had stayed on the reserve instead of leaving his home to celebrate the holiday season. He had stayed longer than expected while finishing up his research on why some of the bears had not yet gone to their dens. Being winter, the bears were supposed to have gone into hibernation, warmly tucked into a hollow tree or under the roots of a huge tree. It was a Friday, and Vitaly was sitting by the window in his cabin with his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Outside, the world was a frozen wasteland. The trees were heavy with snow as their branches bent low under the weight. He took a sip of his tea, savoring the warmth as it spread through his body. He felt the tension in his muscles begin to ease as a sense of calmness washed over him. He had just finished packing and was waiting for his flight out of the reserve. As he stared out at the snow-covered landscape, Vitaly felt a sense of peace. The cold and the silence of the winter seemed to soothe his soul, and for a moment, he could not help but picture the warm reception he would get from Tatiana, his wife, upon his arrival. Her laughter was music to his ears. Her voice and grace made his worries and cares fade away. He missed her. He sipped his tea, lost in thought, as the winter world unfolded before him. He watched as the snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, with each one a unique and delicate creation. It was as if he was seeing the world through new eyes, a new dimension. This filled him with a sense of wonder and awe. And then he saw him. It was Krasavchik. His furry friend was headed to the half-frozen lake to quench his thirst. To kill the boredom, Vitaly decided to follow his favorite bear down to the lake, where he was sure to capture some award-winning pictures and memories to last a lifetime. He geared up and took with him his camera, flare gun, and bear spray, just in case things got out of hand. The lake was less than a mile from his cabin, and so he was sure he would be back before his helicopter arrived. As he stepped out into the snow, he felt the air was crisp and cold with a sharpness that seemed to cut through to the bone. His breath was puffing out clouds and the landscape was eerily quiet, as if the Kamchatka Peninsula itself was holding its breath. But he was no stranger to the harsh elements of this area, so he soldiered on. The growl of his friendly bear quickly freed him from his thoughts. He tried to trudge through the snow-covered trail in order to catch up, but the snow was deep and his feet were heavy. But he was determined. He quickly put on his cross-country skis, which allowed him to effortlessly glide across the snow-covered trail. He could see the bear's paw prints still fresh in the snow and was determined to keep up with Krasovchik. He pushed himself to go faster, his muscles strained and burned with exertion at the effort of pushing himself to the limit. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but he did not falter. He tightened his coat around him. The trail wound its way through the trees, and he followed it cautiously with his senses heightened by the knowledge that a bear was nearby. Moments later, he saw Krasovchik. There he was in a grove, sleeping soundly. His usually brown fur was now gleaming in the winter sunlight. This was going to be the perfect picture as a reward for his turmoil in the harsh weather. Vitaly took out his camera, but taking a clear picture was impossible as the snow-covered branches and tree trunks kept getting in his way. He then made the risky decision to get inside the grove. He took his skis and stuck them vertically in the snow, got down on all fours, and then crawled, ducking and weaving through the tight spaces as he made his way through the branches. His eyes were fixed on his friend Krasovchik and his senses alert. He could hear his heavy but rhythmic breathing as he struggled to make his way through the pouring snow. The sound was almost peaceful, a big contrast to the natural ferocity of the bear. His chest rose and fell with each inhale, and with each exhale, a small plume of steam escaped from his nostrils, dissipating into the chilly air. It was a sight that melted Vitaly's heart. At about 3 meters from the sleeping bear, Vitaly took out his camera, ready to capture the beautiful scene for his memory book, as he had done numerous times before. On Saturday, the following day, the helicopter arrived, ready to airlift Vitaly out of the reserve for his holiday. The pilot found packed bags and a cold cup of tea by the cabin's window, but Vitaly was nowhere to be seen. He, without hesitation, called the search and rescue team, which arrived promptly and began searching. They followed Vitaly's ski trail, and just about a mile from the cabin, they found his skis at the entrance of the grove, placed vertically in the snow, just as he had done the day before. The rescue team then followed Vitaly's tracks into the grove, and just about 3 meters in, there he was. Vitaly's body lay there motionless. His bear spray can was empty, which led the rescue team to believe that he had used it to try to save his life. In the snow, they could see Krasovchik's tracks where he leapt to attack Vitaly. It seemed that the spray hadn't deterred the bear from attacking him. On his right side lay the unfired flare gun, which was half eaten. His camera lay inches away from his body. It was bloody and broken. The search and rescue team brought his lifeless body back from the wilderness for goodbyes and burial from his family. Despite his numerous research journals, Vitaly's proactive approach of monitoring bears was broadly criticized by the conservation movement community, who argued that he went against the consensual passive method of ethology. In his defense, Vitaly claimed that he never underestimated the tenacity of the bears, but this wasn't how his critics saw it, as to them, his death seemed to be a confirmation of their worries. In addition, in excess of over 20 bears that had become habituated in the presence of Vitaly were easy targets for poachers and were killed just before and shortly after his death. As it is with nature, wild animals are just that, wild. One shouldn't get too comfortable when approaching wildlife, as their wild traits are intrinsically imprinted in their genetics, and they can snap at any time, leaving behind a lifeless body. For Vitaly, this was a lesson learned a bit too late, but his journals shall forever be a constant reminder of his contribution to the science and academic community. He was a great loss to both man and nature, and the very animal he based his life around ultimately led to his final affliction.
Yellowstone National Park is an American national park located in the western United States, largely in the northwest corner of Wyoming and extending into Montana and Idaho. Yellowstone was the first national park in the U.S. and is also widely held to be the first national park in the world. The park is known for its many geothermal features, especially the Old Faithful Geyser, one of its most popular. While it represents many types of biomes, the subalpine forest is the most abundant. It's part of the South Central Rockies forest ecoregion, which spans an area of 3,468 square miles. It comprises of lakes, canyons, rivers, and beautiful mountain ranges. Yellowstone Lake is one of the largest high-elevation lakes in North America and is centered over the Yellowstone caldera, the largest supervolcano on the continent. It has erupted with tremendous force several times in the last 2 million years and is overdue to explode again soon. Grizzly bears, wolves, and free-ranging herds of bison and elk live in this park. It's safe to say Yellowstone National Park is a dangerous place to be, and with numerous recreational opportunities, including hiking, camping, boating, fishing, and sightseeing attracting nearly 5 million visitors each year, it's no surprise that it's seen its fair share of tragic deaths. On April 15, 2021, Charles Mock, who was 40 years old at the time, set out into the park to do some fishing in the place he loved most, Yellowstone National Park. Charles was always an avid lover of the outdoors, ever since early childhood. But out of all places in the world he fell in love with, Yellowstone. When he turned 30, he moved there permanently, just so he could spend every bit of spare time he had in the park. The overwhelming sense of peace and happiness he experienced in the rugged remoteness of the park was so much that he soon sought out work inside the park. Charles wanted to spend every waking second of the day in Yellowstone, and finally got his wish when he landed a job as a tour guide for backcountry adventure. Charles wanted to catch some trout at his favorite fishing spot on the Madison River, deep in the wilderness of Yellowstone. He was aware of the risks and dangers that come with venturing this far into the wild, but had been fishing all week without any problems. It's well known that the presence of grizzly bears is an everlasting threat to the lives of all fishermen, hunters, hikers, campers. Anyone venturing into the wilderness here is advised to carry some form of self-protection, and Charles knew this. He always made sure to keep his pistol and bear spray with him, just in case he ever had to use it. But after a week of fishing, he felt safe enough to leave his pistol at home and only bring with him his bear spray. Charles arrived at the river and began unpacking his equipment from his truck. He gathered his fishing pole, camera, and supplies, and began soaking in the peace that he always felt here. He also brought along his tackle box full of other important items and began his half-a-mile hike down the trail towards the water. As always, he kept a wary eye out during the walk for the variety of dangerous animals in the area. Bison, grizzly bears, and even moose have been involved in attacks on humans in prior years, and that was the last thing Charles wanted to come across alone in the wilderness. He'd had his fair share of bears encounters throughout the years. Charles and his friend Riley had numerous run-ins with grizzlies who had even bluff charged them several times to intimidate them. Luckily, they were always just warnings to scare off the men who, thankfully, were never actually attacked, but a terrifying experience nonetheless. As Charles walked along the riverbank, looking for a good spot to dip his line and snap photos of the beautiful scenery, he unknowingly walked into one of the most dangerous situations he could have found. It was a large moose carcass that looked to be half-eaten by a grizzly bear. What Charles failed to realize was that the bear who claimed this food source had already been fighting to defend its food to the point of killing and partially eating another grizzly. It was still enraged and irritated from the fight and watching in the distance. Charles froze as soon as he realized what he was walking towards and quietly scanned the tree line while listening carefully for any signs of the bear. He slowly began backing up the way he came, being careful not to turn his back to the carcass. He knew that if the grizzly was watching it, would be more likely to attack him while his back was turned. All of a sudden, Charles heard a loud woof sound that he recognized as a bear, which sent shivers down his spine. He immediately stopped in his tracks and surveyed the area around him for the upset bear, while simultaneously pulling out his bear spray as a precaution, as he prepared himself mentally for what is typically a very tense standoff. As he searched the brush for the bear, the forest turned eerily silent for a few seconds. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the bear charging toward him. Carl prayed that it was just another bluff charge. Time stood still for Charles as he watched the bear's eyes focusing solely on him as it came rocketing in his direction. The bear closed the last 100 feet of distance with blinding speed as Charles unloaded his bear spray at the grizzly. The orange cloud of bear spray engulfed the bear, but it seemed to have done nothing but make the bear more angry as it quickly tackled and knocked Charles to the ground. The 700-pound bear pinned Charles to the ground and focused its attack on Charles' head and neck. It swiped its massive claws through Charles' flesh, while its powerful jaws carved grooves into his skull. The bear seemed to be targeting its attack on Charles' head, continuously biting and swiping at his scalp, removing significant portions of flesh in the process. It then bit into his neck, tearing flesh and crucial arteries from his body. Blood started to spray onto the bear and forest around him. Charles desperately raised his hands over his head and neck as a shield, but the bear clamped down on them and crushed them into useless lumps of bleeding flesh. Then the bear went in for the kill. It gripped Charles' head in its mouth and squeezed down in an attempt to crush his skull, but only managed to penetrate one of its canine teeth fully through his skull. Now, with a 2-inch hole through Charles' skull, his hands mangled and his scalp torn to shreds, the bear stopped the attack and went back to the moose carcass just a few hundred feet away. Charles was now laying unconscious in a pool of his own blood, barely hanging on to life. He gained consciousness about 10 minutes later, and despite his condition, he was determined to get to an area to reach out for help. He tried crawling, but the pain was so overwhelming he was unable to move. Charles managed to prop himself in an upright position against a tree stump where he slowly searched his supplies with his only useful hand to find his cell phone to call for help. He dialed 911, and emergency responders were immediately dispatched. Charles remained on the phone with 911 for nearly an hour while he waited. He had to direct the officers to his location, somewhere deep in Yellowstone National Park. When they found him, he was still clutching his bear spray can in his functioning hand, despite it being completely emptied on the bear previously. He was stabilized to the best of their abilities at the scene and immediately transported to the Eastern Idaho Emergency Medical Center in Idaho Falls for life-saving emergency medical support. The next day, as Charles and the medical team fought for his life, Montana game wardens approached the area. They made a lot of noise and were very clear in their efforts to run the bear off so they could complete their investigation into the attack. However, the bear had other plans. As they approached the attack scene, it emerged from cover in the same threatening manner as it addressed Charles. The bear's head was low with its ears pinned back in a clear sign of aggression. The wardens fired off special rounds that crackle and pop in an attempt to persuade the bear to back off, but it failed. As the bear powered toward the 7 volunteers and their dog, it got bogged down in some thick brush, temporarily slowing its attack. The bear quickly regained its traction and continued its advance toward the group. The bear reached within 40 feet of the men before they discharged lethal rounds and dropped the bear. As its blood seeped into the soil, its rage and aggression dissipated as it stopped all movement. The wardens performed a necropsy on the bear's carcass and investigated the attack scene. On Charles' clothes, they had noted the contents of his bear spray can. As they examined the bear, the same was found on its fur, meaning that Charles had in fact discharged his bear spray successfully. Once the bear had been cut open and the contents of its guts analyzed, the wardens determined that the bear had been feeding on the moose it was defending. They also found tissue from at least one other grizzly bear, confirming that the grizzly bear was previously fighting off other bears in defense of its meal. This is the most likely reason the bear was so aggressive towards Charles and the wardens. Back at the medical center, Charles had 2 surgical procedures in an attempt to save him. According to doctors, the surgeries went well, but sadly, within a few days, Charles suffered a severe stroke and died from the trauma inflicted during the bear attack. West Yellowstone organized a memorial service at the Union Pacific Dining Lodge in town, and his family held their own private ceremony in commemoration of Charles. 2 nights after Charles was mauled, the town of West Yellowstone had another bear visit them. The locals point out that the bears are so numerous that they can hardly avoid run-ins with them. The greater Yellowstone area, which spans portions of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, is reported to have more than 700 grizzly bears. Fatal attacks have increased in recent decades as the bears recover from their threatened status. Humans have also begun moving into rural areas more than ever before. Since 2010, grizzlies have killed 8 people. They are still under federal protection in areas outside of Alaska, although recent discussions have begged review of that status. More and more people fear that as long as the grizzlies remain protected, their numbers will continue to rise, increasing the chances of more innocent people meeting their unfortunate final affliction.
Our story today takes place in Bella Coola, a valley found in British Columbia, Canada. It stretches 80 kilometers and is known to be a very scenic and beautiful area, with a diverse landscape of meadows, forests, mountains, and rivers, as well as a long history of world-renowned craftsmanship. There really is something for everyone. As picturesque as this area may be, it is also situated in the Great Bear Rainforest, thusly named for its inhabitants, specifically many wild species of cougars, wolves, and of course, bears. But these bears are special. Although there are 1,400 grizzly bears living there, this area is home to a distinctive subspecies of black bear, the Kermode bear, also known as the spirit bear, as 1/10 of the cubs are born with the recessive gene causing a white coat of fur. As a result of its unique residence, the Great Bear Rainforest has been protected by the government of British Columbia since 2016 to stop industrial logging, meaning that 85% of the ancient forests will be kept safe. Given that the population of Bella Coola is only 2,100 people, there is approximately 1 bear to every 2 people in the area. Despite this, bear attacks have been very rare and they usually live side by side fairly peacefully. However, there is one incident that would change that forever. Jordan Carbery was a park ranger living in Bella Coola in 2018. He enjoyed his job, it was fairly easy, and he was able to work in such a beautiful place every day. On July 2nd, he was returning home after a lovely holiday with his friends to celebrate his 50th birthday. And as he approached his home, he saw 2 grizzly bears climbing a cherry tree nearby. This was not uncommon as the fruit on the trees were ripe and bears are well-known cherry lovers and they actually help with the dispersion process for the trees. They seemed quite large, so Jordan assumed they were just typical adult bears searching for food and meant no harm, although he would rather they were further away from his house. He continued up his driveway to encourage them to leave his property, and they eventually took the hint, traipsing back into the forests. He didn't give the interaction a second thought as he was used to seeing bears all the time, and he went to bed as soon as he got in. At 5 a.m. the next morning, he woke up and started to get ready as he usually did when something caught his eye out of the window. There was something moving behind the trees, and so he assumed it was the cherry-eating adult grizzlies from last night. He grabbed his camera and rushed downstairs, leaving the house to take photos that he thought he would later share with his friends. He was an avid photographer, and living in the beautiful place that he did meant that he was able to take amazing photos of his daily life. He figured that if he didn't spook the bears, they would ignore him and he could get some nice pictures of them eating the cherries. So he walked out into the forest, and 36 feet from his front door, he had a clear view of the bears in the tree. While he was watching the bears, one of them fell from the tree and suddenly something moved next to Jordan. He turned to see what it was and his heart stopped. He had made a mistake. The bears in the tree were actually cubs and were being supervised by their mother, the very large bear that was currently staring at him from 80 feet away. She had heard her cub cry out, and upon spotting Jordan, assumed the cry to be his fault. He knew that he was in a lot of trouble. She began walking towards him and then running straight towards him. Although he had been trained on how to react to grizzly bears and knew in the back of his mind that he should play dead, his natural instincts took over in the face of a 500-pound killing machine sprinting right at him. He turned and ran, knowing that he was only a short distance from his house and thought maybe he could get in the door before she mauled him to death. He was running for his life, and he knew that the next few seconds could determine the rest of his life, however long that may be. Just 10 feet from his door, the bear smacked him in the back with her huge paw, and he was sent flying onto the ground. He was winded by the impact and barely had any time to register what was happening to him as he tried to stand up again. Immediately, the bear jumped on him and grabbed him by his head, trying to crush his skull in her strong jaws. He was terrified as he knew there was no way he could overpower the animal. Suddenly, he felt his feet leave the floor as he was lifted by his skull into the air. He thought he must be done for. The force was too much for his skull, and a large part of his scalp was ripped off, the pain blinding Jordan as he fell to the floor, blood gushing everywhere. He thought he could maybe crawl away as the bear was now holding his scalp in her mouth, so he was hoping she would just leave. He was wrong. After throwing Jordan's scalp aside, the bear began mauling his whole body. She tore off his ear and began to rip apart his chest, seemingly taking the cub's fall personally against Jordan, and it was like she had decided that he had to pay for the pain of her cub. He knew that his time was running out as the animal was not showing any signs of slowing down, seemingly determined to mercilessly tear him apart. He realized that he was not going to be able to wait it out or hope that she would leave, and in that moment, he remembered some of the training that he had been given in the past for this exact situation. He began to punch her in the head with as much strength as he could, which just further angered the bear. She flipped him onto his side to get his fists away from her and continued her attack. He quickly started kicking her in the eye with his heel, adrenaline increasing his strength, even though he had now lost a significant amount of blood. The bear started to back away a little, confused by the sudden rebuttal attack, and this gave Jordan enough time to pull himself to his feet again. After a second, the bear charged at him again, planning to end the fight once and for all. Jordan tried to punch her once again, this time aiming for her nose, but she managed to dodge his fists. As he continued to punch at the bear, he was able to slowly back away into his house and shut the door, waiting for the attack to continue. He knew that this door was only thin and the animal would easily be able to break it down with just a few body slams, but nothing happened. He waited for the crash of the bear entering the house to finish the job, but she never did. Instead, she just walked back into the forest, returned to her cubs, and left the scene. Although Jordan was thankful that the bear had now left him alone, he was now faced with another problem: surviving his extensive injuries. He lived in the middle of nowhere, he didn't have phone service, who would he contact for help? He had no choice, he had to save himself. He managed to grab his car keys from upstairs, the adrenaline from the attack slowly wearing off, but he knew that if he passed out, he would never wake up again. Holding his chest closed, he left the house without checking his surroundings, and the bear had reappeared. She started charging at him once again, but he managed to get into the car and drive away. He was praying that he would make it to the hospital, praying that he would be able to see his wife and daughter again. Amazingly, he survived the drive and made it to his local hospital, where he was immediately airlifted to the Vancouver hospital. He had to have many surgeries in order to save his life. His right ear had been torn off, half of his scalp was missing, he had several puncture wounds from where the bear had tried to rip him apart, and an umbilical hernia from the repetitive clawing from the bear. He had a long recovery journey ahead of him, but he was just grateful to be alive. He counted his blessings that she hadn't caught him that final time as he reached the car, and accepts that the accident was fully his fault, as he shouldn't have risked his life just for some photos. He should have known better given his experience working with the bears, and recognized that the bears were cubs and kept an eye on his surroundings. Either way, he was lucky to survive and went on to have a full recovery, narrowly escaping his final affliction.